A thin column of smoke rose into the morning sky, drifting over a quiet Japanese city where the cicadas hummed their usual summer chorus. No one knew that within minutes, that same sky would rupture with a brilliance so intense that eyewitnesses later said the sun itself seemed to fall to Earth. The moment it happened, 8:15 a.m. August 6th, 1945, time seemed to split in two, a world before the flash and a world after it. Hiroshima, a city of rivers, streetcars, and wooden homes, stirred awake under a single American bomber. Most residents barely looked up. B-29s had flown overhead before, and this one seemed alone, hardly a threat. Children rushed to school, factory workers adjusted their uniforms, and office clerks opened windows to let in the warm breeze. Even the air raid sirens that morning felt routine, almost ignorable. But then, for reasons still debated by historians, the all-clear signal sounded. People stepped back into the sunlight, unaware of the object descending through the calm blue sky. A bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The weapon detonated 600 meters above the city with a blast so silent, so eerily beyond human experience, that many survivors later insisted they heard nothing. One moment, they stood in familiar streets. The next, an invisible wave punched outward at supersonic speed. Shadows burned into stone, roof tiles shredded like paper. Entire neighborhoods dissolved in a white-hot furnace of unimaginable heat. And yet, the story of Hiroshima did not begin that morning. It began decades earlier, hidden in laboratories, war rooms, and a global conflict whose stakes escalated far beyond conventional firepower. In the early 1930s, physicists learned that atoms could be split, releasing staggering amounts of energy. It was the sort of discovery that belonged equally in a science journal and a nightmare. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, some of the world's greatest scientists, many of them Jewish refugees, pressed the United States to investigate atomic research. Among them was Albert Einstein, whose letter to President Roosevelt set the Manhattan Project in motion. What followed was a secret enterprise so vast that even Vice President Truman didn't know of its existence until he became president. Entire towns, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford, sprang up almost overnight. Families lived behind fences, children played under watchtowers, and everyone worked without knowing the full picture. Engineers enriched uranium. Physicists calculated impossible equations. Military crews trained for missions no one could describe aloud. They were building a bomb designed not merely to destroy cities, but to end a global war. Meanwhile, in Japan, the war dragged on with a desperation that defied the odds. Despite losing territory and facing severe shortages, its government remained committed to a fight-to-the-death defense. American planners anticipated an invasion that could claim millions of lives on both sides. Each day, the conflict continued. More nations burned, more innocents suffered, and more leaders sought a decisive end. That was the backdrop against which the crew of the Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island in the early hours of August 6th. Inside their aircraft, the bomb was armed mid-flight by a team working with steady hands and, by some accounts, an uneasy quiet. Some later admitted they weren't entirely sure what would happen once the bomb detonated, only that it would be unlike anything used in war before. Back over Hiroshima, after the blinding explosion, the world twisted into unrecognizable forms. A young boy, searching for his school, felt the heat sear his skin before he even heard a sound. A woman hanging laundry saw her clothes catch fire while still wet. In a hospital, doctors who survived the blast suddenly found themselves treating thousands, many coated in ash, some too burned to be touched. Rivers filled with people seeking relief from the overwhelming heat, turning the water into a grim flowing testimony to the bomb's power. Yet even in the middle of this devastation, survivors, known as hibakusha, recall acts of quiet courage. A streetcar conductor, horribly burned, guided passengers to safety while barely able to stand. A group of students dug through debris with their bare hands, searching for classmates. A young nurse, overwhelmed by the sight of injuries she had never imagined in training, whispered to herself a vow to help anyone she could, no matter how hopeless it seemed. News of what had happened traveled slowly. American officials released statements describing a new kind of bomb with more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. But few grasped the true meaning of those words. Even scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project found themselves stunned when the full scale of the destruction became clear. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, a tragedy intertwined with Hiroshima's story, yet shaped by its own terrible circumstances. But it was the first blast, the one that split the sky over a quiet city, that shocked the world into realizing that humanity had crossed a threshold it could never uncross. In the days after the bombing, strange symptoms appeared among survivors. People who looked uninjured suddenly fell ill. Hair came out in handfuls. Purple blotches spread across skin. Doctors, many of whom had lost their own families, struggled to understand what they were seeing. Radiation sickness, a condition barely understood even by the scientists who had built the bomb, began to claim thousands more lives, long after the fires had cooled. The Japanese government, still reeling from the destruction, debated its response. Some leaders argued to continue the fight, convinced the United States had only one such weapon. Others recognized the truth. The war was unwinnable, and every day it continued would mean countless more deaths. When Emperor Hirohito finally addressed the nation, his voice, rarely heard by the public, carried a tone of somber resignation. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, marking the beginning of Japan's surrender and the formal close of World War II. But the end of the war did not bring an end to the questions raised by Hiroshima. Instead, it opened decades of debate. Should the bomb have been used? Would Japan have surrendered without it? Could a demonstration have convinced its leaders to stop fighting? Historians, ethicists, military strategists, and survivors have wrestled with these questions ever since, and none have been settled conclusively. What grew in the aftermath were two intertwined legacies. One was geopolitical, the Cold War nuclear arms race, where atomic weapons multiplied into tens of thousands. Nations lived under the constant threat that the horror scene in Hiroshima might one day be repeated on a global scale. The other legacy was human. The stories of those who survived the blast, rebuilt their city, and dedicated their lives to preventing such a weapon from ever being used again. Hiroshima today is a place where contradictions meet. Cherry blossoms bloom beside monuments engraved with names of the lost. School groups walk past the skeletal frame of the atomic bomb dome, capturing photos before falling silent at the cenotaph that holds the ashes of unidentified victims. The Peace Memorial Museum displays charred lunchboxes fused roof tiles, and letters written by children who never returned home. Each object holds a story that refuses to fade. Perhaps the most unexpected legacy is the resilience of the survivors. Many suffered in ways that defy comprehension: physical pain, social discrimination, nightmares that lasted decades. Yet they became some of the world's strongest advocates for peace. One survivor, who was only a teenager at the time, later traveled the world telling his story to anyone who would listen, insisting that no country should ever experience what he had seen. Another survivor, a girl who folded over 1,000 paper cranes hoping for recovery, inspired a movement that continues today as a symbol of peace and remembrance. The story of Hiroshima is not simply a tale of destruction. It is a mirror held up to humanity. It forces us to confront the extraordinary consequences of our scientific achievements, the moral complexities of war, and the fragility of the world we build around ourselves. It is a story with no easy heroes, no simple villains, and no comfortable conclusions. Yet it remains a story that must be told. Because on that August morning, under a sky that looked peaceful enough to trust, the world learned how quickly everything familiar can vanish. And in the decades that followed, we learned something just as important: that the survivors, despite everything they lost, continued to look toward a future where such a morning would never dawn again. Their voices echo across generations, reminders not only of what happened, but of what must never happen again.